Welcome to this lesson on mental math and manual calculation best practices for the GMAT exam. So let's begin talking just about the function of the quantitative section and how you'll have to manage your calculation on that section of the GMAT. So first off, understand that there's no calculator provided nor allowed for the quantitative section of the GMAT. But the GMAC, people who put forth the exam, don't highly value manual calculation as a premium skill. So while it's something you may need to work on, you need to recognize that it's like a foundational ability for this test because they kind of expect you to be able to do all of the manual basic for functions, exponents, fractions, decimals, percentages, manipulations as a baseline for the exam. Now, your calculations in the quantitative section should produce clean results or be able to be approximated. So that means that you should be able to use some of the techniques that we're going to discuss in this lesson in order to avoid extensive longhand manipulation. But there's also often opportunities to potentially approximate to save yourself some time as well within the quantitative section. Now, in the integrated reasoning section, it is imperative to recognize that an interface calculator is provided. Many test takers forget that there's an interface calculator. You definitely want to use it for the IR because, again, the GMAC does not value manual calculation as a premium skill, so they're basically saying you shouldn't be doing it at all in the IR. And for that reason, there can be clumsy and convoluted calculations within the integrated reasoning section. And you'll want to use the integrated reasoning calculator if they're asking you to multiply, say, 250,000 times 34.8. That's not an easy manipulation necessarily, and they're recognizing that you should be aware of the calculator's existence to simplify the amount of time that it should take you to do that sort of clumsy calculation. Now, the strategic implications are as such. So this is going to be the first ability that you needed to develop in order to achieve especially high-end GMAT goals, and especially as it pertains to the quantitative section. If you're not able to manually calculate in all of the non-integer formats of the arithmetic, if you're struggling with your basic times tables, if it's a struggle for you to do, say, 14 times 17 in an efficient fashion, you really have to find a way to improve that skill quickly in order to get yourself where you want to go with this exam. And the best way to do that is using free mathaids.com drills to improve both speed and accuracy. And we'll look at the MathAids website a little later in this lesson and discuss specifically what you'll want to spend your time on first, but it is very much a personalized experience, what you need to work on. For instance, some students and test takers may struggle a bit more with fractions as opposed to decimals, while others may not really be all that familiar with percentages. So you'll have to take your own lead a little bit, and while we'll have some basics for you to start with, but you'll really want to consider what your own needs are within the MathAids realm. So let's go ahead and talk about how to mentally manipulate some of the math on the exam based on the idea of easy factors or multiples. And you're going to want to seek factors of 2, 5, 10, 100, and a half to facilitate easy mental calculations. And you may be asking yourself, well, why is it 2, 5, 10, 100, and a half? Well, it's biology. Our 2 hands, our 5 fingers, and our 10 toes, I won't pick up my toes and show them to you, but our 10 toes are going to be the basis of decimals. If we had 14 total fingers and 14 total toes, we would do everything off of a base 14 system, but we don't, so it's tens. And that's just the biology of arithmetic, as it were. So one of the first skills that you'll want to build for yourself is the ability to double and halve numbers quickly. So if each digit in any number is less than or equal to 4, you'll simply double each digit. So if we're looking at, say, 24 times 2, we just double that 2 to a 4, and that 4 to an 8, and we get 48. If we're trying to do 204 times 2, we just double that 2 to a 4. That tens digit of 0 remains a 0, and we double that 4 in the units digit up to an 8, and we know that 204 times 2 is 408. And you're probably thinking to yourself, this is feeling pretty natural. And again, it's biology. Now, if any of those digits is greater than 4, you'll want to double your leftmost digit first and then work to the units. So let's take a look at another slightly more complex example where we've got 596 times 2. So first, we'll just consider that 500 with the 5 in the hundreds digit. So 500 times 2 will be 1,000. Then we've got the 90 left, so that's going to be 90 times 2, which is going to be 180. And then we've got the 6 at the end, and that 6 times 2 is going to be 12. And we just sum those three values to find that 596 times 2 is 1,192. Now, there's another little trick you can do, which is based off of the factors of 10 and 100 and a half that we'll experience here in a little bit. But as a preview, you can really easily round 596 times 2 up to 600. And if I did 600 times 2 minus 4 times 2, I'd also have 1,200 minus 8, which would get me to the exact same 1,192. So you can see the flexible nature of arithmetic. And if your units digit is even and you want to halve, you will divide your leftmost digit by 2 first, and in this case, in the example that we see, that'll be hundreds again, and then you'll work towards the units. So, say for instance, 476 divided by 2. Well, we take that 400, the 4 from the hundreds digit, divide that by 2. We'll then add that to 70 divided by 2, and then add that to 6 divided by 2. So we have 200 plus 35 plus 3 is going to be 238, which is exactly 476 divided by 2. And these doubles and halves, the exam really rewards you in some kind of clever ways if you're able to recognize opportunities to double and halve and make your mental math go a little bit faster. Like, for instance, that 596 times 2, just round up to 600 example. So let's take a look at another way that you can mentally manipulate math, and that's by manipulating by factors of 10. Because again, everything in the decimal system is based off of multiples of 10. So if you're just multiplying by 10, all you have to do is shift your decimal one place to the right. So if, for instance, we have 2.3 times 10, that's just going to be 23. If we've got 23 times 10, you may be thinking to yourself, well, where's my decimal point? Remember that there's always an implied decimal at the end of any integer. So if you're doing 23 times 10, you just shift it over and keep a 0 in terms of that implicit decimal. And we know that 23 times 10 is going to be 230. Now, we also, by rule of just the way the decimal system works, know that multiplying by 10 to the nth power, you just shift the decimal n places right. So in the examples we just saw, 10 is, of course, 10 to the first power. So we just shift the decimal one place when multiplying by 10. And if we wanted to consider 100, that's going to be 10 to the second power. So using our same 2.3, we multiply that by 100, we shift the decimal place 2 places to the right because 100 is 10 to the second power. If we even wanted to go to our 2.3 times 1 million, or 10 to the 6th power, we then just shift the decimal 6 places to the right, and we know that 2.3 times a million will be 2,300,000, or what some people will call 2.3 million. And if you're dividing by 10 to an n power, you just shift the n decimal, or the decimal n places left, in the exact opposite direction. So if we were looking at, say, 590 divided by 10, well, that, of course, is 590 divided by 10 to the first. So we just shift over one place to the left, lop off the 0, and we've got 590 divided by 10 is 59. If we did 590 divided by 100, or 10 to the second power, we'd be looking at 5.9. And even if we continue to get larger and we did something, for instance, such as 590 divided by 10 to the 4th power, or 10,000, we'd have a result of 0.059. So you can manipulate by factors of 10 by multiplying or dividing and knowing the power of 10 to determine how many places you need to shift those decimals. And so you can also, as we kind of alluded to with that earlier example involving 1,192, you can expedite addition and subtraction by seeking factors of 10. So let's look at how that'll work. So for instance, 484 plus 72. First, let's just mentally shift that 2 from 480 to 484 from 72 and reimagine the addition as 486 plus 70, which is the exact same thing as 484 plus 72, and it just makes the mental manipulation easier. Because first, we know that that units digit is going to remain a 6 because we're just adding to 70 486. So that means we don't have to worry about the 6 anymore. All we really need to worry about is the 480 and the 70. So you just sum the hundreds and the tens digits and put the 6 back in. So 48 plus 7 is going to be 55. And that 55, we just got to bring back in the 6. So we know that 486 plus 70 and thereby 484 plus 72 is equal to 556. So again, just kind of moving the Legos of numbers, as it were. Then for something like 973 minus 81, subtract 1 from each of the values to reimagine the difference that we're seeking as 972 minus 80. Because if you do the same thing to each side of the subtraction, you know you end up with the same result. So then we're going to basically have the same rule. We know that the units digit will remain a 2 because we just got rid of one end of the units digit basically and kept it as a 0. So the units digit is going to stay a 2 because we know we're subtracting 80 from 972. And then we just have to do similarly to what we did in the previous example. Subtract the hundreds and tens digits, and so we know that 970 minus 80 is going to be 97 minus 8, or 89, and then we just got to bring the 2 back in as the units digit, so we know that 973 minus 81 is going to be 892. Obviously, more practice will help, but hopefully you're seeing how using these factors of 2, 5, 10, 100, and a half, and exploiting our own biology can help you work through your mental math more easily, and these examples are honestly probably a little bit more complex than you can expect on the exam, but they're used to show you how the concepts and the fundamentals work here. So if you want to expedite multiplication, you can do so by seeking factors of 10 as well. So this is a more realistic GMAT kind of manipulation compared to, say, the addition and subtraction, to be honest. So they kind of expect you to look at something like 48 times 72 and go, wow, that's really annoying math. But you can recognize that the closest and easiest multiple of 10 in this product is probably 50, which is really nearby 48. So you already, from what we know about multiplying by 10, if we wanted to do 72 times 100, that's going to be 7200. We just shifted that decimal over 2 places. And we know that half of that product is going to be equal to 72 times 50. So therefore, we know that 72 divided by 2 is going to be 3600, because again, the zeros stay the same, and we know that 72 divided by 2 is 36. Simple enough again. And we know thereby that 72 times 50 is 3600. So now we just have to subtract that 72 times 2 that's left over to get down to 72 times 48. So if we take away 72 times 2, or 144, and again, you can just do the 70 times 2, 140, plus 2 times 2 for 4 to get to 144 if you haven't memorized that part of the times table yet. We just have to take away that 144 from 3600 to get to 72 times 48. So you can even see this illustrated through the true factoring, because if we did 72 times 50 minus 72 times 2, we can actually factor out the 72s. We're left with 72 times 50 minus 2, and there's our 72 times 48, which is the same as 48 times 72, because as you know, order does not matter for multiplication. So then all we have to do is 3600 minus 100 to start to get down to 3500, then just subtract the 44, or you can subtract 40 and then 4 to reach 3456, which is the product of 48 times 72, hopefully done in fewer than 30 seconds if you're able to manipulate based on these factors of 10. Now, the last little bit here is going to be long division, and you kind of want to manipulate manually, but here's the good news. Long division is just bad marketing. I don't know who necessarily did the marketing, but it doesn't take that long. So let's take a look at an example of long division. So We got 24 going into a relatively large dividend here of 5,520. So the first step is to see how many times 24 goes into 55. And of course, 24 goes into 55 two times. You multiply that 2 times 24, and we would subtract that 48 from the original 55. So then we drop in a 7 and bring down the 2, and then we got to see how many times 24 goes into 72. 24 is going to go into 72 exactly 3 times. So then we'd multiply 3 times 24 and subtract 72 from 72, thereby leaving behind only a 0. And we're basically done to discover that 5,520 divided by 24 is 230 exactly. So again, you can see long division, there aren't as many mental math tricks to do. You can just kind of go bit by bit. The long division format kind of facilitates the same kind of easy chunking for the arithmetic. So how are we going to improve these skills? As we mentioned at the beginning, it's largely going to be mathaids.com. So it's a free online resource that we'll take a look at here momentarily. And they have dynamically produced worksheets. So every time you click the Create It button that we'll look at here in a moment, you're going to get a brand new worksheet of just somewhere between probably 10 to 100 problems, depending on the worksheet. And we'll talk about some of the best worksheets that I like to recommend for my students who are trying to improve upon the GMAT. And then you'll cover all your GMAT calculation topics if you follow along with the rest of this lesson using mathaids.com. So the way that you'll want to use MathAids is try to work in 2 to 5 worksheets daily for about 5 to 20 minutes worth of practice. This should not be an hours upon hours upon hours amount of work. It's really just to make sure that you're improving speed, improving accuracy through repetition and execution. So focus on areas of difficulty more frequently. Another thing that I've seen with working with students over the decades is that people tend to try to practice the thing they're already better at. Don't go do the times tables for the 99th time if you're really struggling with fractions. Focus on the areas of difficulty more frequently. Those will pay more dividends. Also, practice both written manual calculation and mental math, because you will have a scratch pad, either a scratch board for the online exam or the standard yellow pad if you still take the exam in person. So you want to be able to do both, and sometimes you may not find the mental math is going that fast. You still want to be able to do the manual calculations, and you can practice through MathAids. And this really is a great warm-up before you do any quote-unquote real GMAC quantitative practice drills or exams. So this is a way to segregate your day, knowing that most MBA candidates are working or are already in an undergraduate program, have some other life responsibilities that they are required to do on a daily basis as opposed to just doing 10 hours a day of GMAT practice. This is a great way to kind of step away from your other responsibilities and just mentally stretch. Do a times table worksheet, do a percentages worksheet, do an exponents worksheet, whatever it is that you feel you would get the best benefit out of personally, and that just kind of mentally stretches your brain before you do some real quantitative practice or an exam, because it's all too easy if you walk in cold without doing this practice to say something like 8 times 7 is 54. It's way too easy to do so having the practice, the warm-up is always a good idea. You'll want to begin with the top 6 MathAids topics that we will talk about here in a moment, but you can also use their search box as well as the left-hand navigation that we're going to see here momentarily to locate specific content drills outside of the top 6, like geometry or word problems that you know you need to work on. Do limit yourself, though, to topics that you've seen explicitly on the GMAT. MathAids has Algebra 2 and Trig and even some calculus on it. Don't go into those. You don't need them, so instead, just stick to the basics that are going to be outlined here in a moment. Alright, so here we are at mathaids.com, and let's just show you how you can manage this unique little website to the best use of your own. So on the left-hand side, you can see that there are a list of worksheets by topics, and you'll just want to select a category, and we'll go through the categories and what's going to be best related to the GMAT here momentarily. But if you click on something, say, like multiplication, you will then be presented with just a, whoops. You will then be presented with just a list as we scroll down of a bunch of multiplication worksheets. So you can see if we just keep on scrolling down, one of my favorites that shows up here on the left-hand side is the singular multiplication digit multiplication worksheets. So if I select this and I scroll on down here, you can see I can select each number has 1 or 2 digits. I can keep 30 problems. If you'd like to change your language, you can even do that for the instructions, and then you click this Create It button. So if I click the Create It button, you'll see that we get a brand new dynamically produced worksheet of practice. And you can see that we can even use some of our techniques that we just talked about. So for instance, the 15 times 28 there. Well, I know that 15 times 30 is going to be 450, and then I can just subtract 15 times 2, and I know that 15 times 28 is going to be 420. And this is the benefit of math aids. Just coming in and being able to work through a worksheet like this, and sure enough, right after you see the examples, you get the you get the answers. There's not much in the way of explanations, but you've got it all self-contained, and it's dynamic. So we just saw 15 times 28 as our first example there, and if we come back and hit Create It again, it's not going to be 15 times 28. It's going to be, so it looks like 8 times 13 is the first one that they gave us this time, and it's completely randomly generated and a never-ending resource. And the other thing to keep in mind is going to be, of course, that left-hand navigation is going to be where you can find a whole bunch of different topics that you may be interested in. But if you just keep going back to the main Math Aids page, so if we get back to mathaids.com proper, on the right-hand side, you see search mathaids.com, and you can see we've got some terms that I've searched for on behalf of students in recent times. You can search for things like negatives, grouping. I have no idea, but at some point I must have searched for Mount St. Helens in here. But you can see that you can search for some of these common topics within Math Aids to help yourself practice the skills that you specifically need additional work with. Now that we've seen the Math Aids interface, let's talk about the specific topics that you'll want to begin with as you build out your drills for the coming weeks. So, first, multiplication, and you'll go to the multiplication left-hand nav that we just saw, and a couple of the best ones that I like to recommend to start with are going to be your times tables, advanced time drills. They'll allow you to select up to 15 times 15, and singular multiple digit multiplication worksheets, which are the ones that I just showed you on the website. So, those are just a starting point. You can absolutely tailor your own multiplication practice, but even if you are a multiplication whiz, every second counts on this exam, so continue to rotate through that topic. The second of the top 6 topics is going to be the opposite of multiplication division. So definitely do some long division worksheets just so that you reacquaint yourself with how that works. And you'll also want to do some division times table time drills worksheets. Again, just being able to do the basics of like not having to slow down when the question asks somehow that you're being tasked to figure out what 54 divided by 9 is. You want to have those, 2-digit, low 3-digit multiplication division times tables pretty well locked in. Then, exponents and radicals are definitely going to be relevant topics. First, work with some exponents with multiplication and division. That'll allow you to remember how to manipulate exponents manually. And you'll also want to work on some simplifying radicals worksheets. So remembering how to pull out perfect square factors and simplify something down, like, say, determining the square root of 72 is going to be 6 radical 2 because the square root of 72 times the square root of 36 times the square root of 2 is going to be the square root of 72, and hence 6 radical 2 is it simplified. And a good rule of thumb is to just memorize the times tables, multiplication and division, and exponents up to at least 15 squared or 225 and 10 cubed. So there's not a whole lot in terms of 10 cubed, but you really, it's not absolutely imperative to know what 8 cubed is, but you definitely will probably be expected to know that 5 cubed is 125, 6 cubed is going to be 216. These kinds of things come up in some of the harder questions. So good rule of thumb, just try to remember all of your cubes and all of your squares up to 10 and 15 respectively. Now, the other topics are going to deal with non-integer manipulation, starting with fractions. So remind yourself and get reacquainted with how to add and subtract 3 fraction worksheets. Often fractions are one of the more kind of latent skill sets in, or lagging skill sets for GMAT students, just because our standard calculators don't manage fractions all that well. So reacquainting yourself with how to add and subtract fractions is really beneficial. And then multiplying fractions with cross-canceling, because again, the exam rewards the efficiencies, so knowing when you can cancel out numerators and denominators is a good skill to refresh. Then we've got decimals, so this is everything off of the powers of 10, so adding and subtracting worksheets with decimals is just some good basic stuff, not as high priority as some of the other things on this list, but if you're finding yourself being in a position of really not having worked in decimals in a long time, that's a good place to start with decimals. And then multiplying by powers of 10 with decimals, because that's really what the exam tends to focus on as far as decimals go. Remembering that you can use what is known as scientific notation to manipulate decimals, that's going to be probably the more GMAT pertinent skill set for that non-integer format. And then percentages, which they just call percent because it's math aids and it's a little bit antiquated. But using some percentage calculations worksheets will be helpful. And also, you'll want to go into the word problems part of the left-hand navigation and find percentage word problems, because obviously percentages are often leveraged for word problem scenarios on the GMAT. So getting some percentage word problems is also a good place to go. And there's a lot of other topics and other kind of GMAT relevant information and worksheets within the word problems. But again, always be willing to go find other topics that you need to work on and you know you need to work on just from a manual translation or execution perspective, and do that through math aids. So you'll want to become math ambidextrous for these non-integer calculations so that when you encounter fractions on the GMAT, you can manipulate the fractions without having to translate it into percents or decimals, and vice versa. Being able to do these manual calculations, whichever manual calculation is required by the exam, in the most efficient and accurate fashion, while it's not highly rewarded, it is going to be a necessary skill as you continue to do your GMAT practice. So go ahead, try out some of those mathaids.com practice drills. Of course, they are never ending, and go ahead and use these skills on future GMAT practice problems as well.